Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live today of the Afterlife Awareness Conference. My name is April Hanna. I am the host of Path 11 Podcast and also the producer of Path 11 TV. And today we are going live. We're going to be talking about rituals, death, and grief. And I am joined with the founder, Dr. Terry Daniel, who will be here with me. And the conference is running June 24th through the 27th. But we've also decided to invite some of the presenters on today to give you a quick peek, just to introduce you to some of the people who are going to be presenting, but to also be available to you to answer your questions about death and rituals. And that is the topic that we have today. We're also joined by Dr. David Steinhorn. He is the Director of Development for Children's and Perinatal Palliative Care at the Elizabeth Hospice in San Diego. We also have Kitty Edwards, who is the Executive Director of the Living and Dying Consciously Project. And we might also be joined a little bit later by Dr. Ken Doka, who is an expert on grief and has authored so many books. So I would like to welcome everyone who is watching. Please know that we are live. So if you have any comments or questions, you can actually put them in the comment box below. And we will do our best in this next hour or so, 45 minutes, to get to some of your questions. So Terry, let's kind of start with you, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the ritual that you bring to the Afterlife Conference and how you have worked that in. And then we'll kind of just begin to open up this conversation to all of us, because there's a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to this.
Yeah, thank you, April. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And we're going to talk about rituals around death and dying today and grieving. And, the conference itself is a ritual because it's a thing, it's hard to define ritual versus ceremony. A lot of people in this field are always having that conversation. I just published a paper on rituals for death, grief, and transition and wrote a whole thing about what's a ritual and what's a ceremony. And this is my definition. A ritual is something that is kind of done routinely, like you do it every year. Every year you have Christmas dinner with your family, for example, or every day you jog on the same path. That's a ritual. It has meaning, but it also has a repeating, regular sort of nature. A ceremony is something that you do with a specific purpose or intention to create a shift or a feeling or a healing, and that can happen within a ritual. So we could say that the Afterlife Conference, because it happens every year and it has a certain structure, is a ritual. And within that yearly ritual, we have all kinds of ceremonies. And we've had amazing ceremonial experts like Kitty Edwards, Linda Fitch, Austin Wells, Jan Ingalls Smith, wonderful people who are trained as shamanic practitioners who've brought us rituals for working with the other side, for processing grief, for opening the conference, for closing the conference. And today we're going to talk specifically about what kind of little rituals and ceremonies can we do when we're facing a death right in front of our eyes, or something that isn't maybe immediate, but just working through grief for a death or a loss of any kind that's happened in the past. And all of us here are experts on that. And I don't know, April, where would you like to start?
Well, I guess I'd like to just kind of make a personal comment. I remember when I was at one of the Afterlife conferences. Now, I was behind the camera, right, because Path 11 Productions was producing the live stream. And Linda Fitch had given out, it was like a grief packet, but it was a grief altar. And it included like a bowl that you have. There was like a black or blue napkin that you could put it on, and then instructions how you can have your own grief ritual. And I think there was also a candle. And I ended up taking that idea for my mom's ceremony when she had passed away. I decided to do a water ritual for grief. And I created this beautiful altar. My family first was like, okay, usually how we do it is we rent out a funeral parlor and, we go and we see an open casket and, we're quiet and we pray. But this was totally different. My mom ended up being cremated. And I really learned about those types of rituals at the Afterlife Conference and brought that into the celebration of my mom's transition, which was really, really cool and really beautiful and really different for our family to, have like these altars, set up and bowls of water and educating them about like what this is. They probably thought I had lost my mind, but it was really beautiful. And at the end, everyone just thought that it was just so nice and it was so different and it was a different way for our family to grieve. So that was just a personal story that I wanted to share because it was something that I took away from the conference a couple of years ago, and I've shared that with some of my clients as well. So
I'm so glad you told that story, and that's Kitty's specialty. So she's going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to jump in also with a personal one that relates to what David can talk about, and that's the rituals you can do in a clinical setting. And when my mother died, she died in the hospital. And when the CNAs, the nursing assistants, came to prepare her body to be taken to the mortuary, I stayed in the room and did that with them because I've done that with lots of hospice patients. And I did a body blessing ceremony for her where I took a washcloth and I kind of washed her eyes to bless all she had seen. And I washed her chest for her heart for all she had loved, and her womb for the babies that she had birthed, and her legs and her feet for the path that she had walked. And the nurses had never seen anybody do anything like this. And there are things like this you can do in a hospital. So David could probably talk about that, but let's go to Kitty to talk about what April was describing.
Oh, I'm so glad, April, you were talking about altars, because altars are so simple to do and they can take so many different forms. When I'm working with someone who is approaching the threshold of death, oftentimes we set up an altar for their life so they can see it across the room, and different visitors or loved ones or family members come in and put different things on the altar to commemorate their life. So you can start the practice of altar even before someone has crossed the threshold. But then afterwards, of course, an altar is a place you go to meet yourself and to grieve and to connect with what you have lost. You're living with loss and grieving. And so altars are a place that you can go and be quiet and reflect and cry. So altars is such a simple thing to do. You can build altars out in nature. Where you love to walk. You can build an altar with a tree, if a tree invites you to build an altar for your loved one. So there's just a wide variety. And Terry, I love the example of your mom blessing the body after someone has died. That is a ceremony to thank them for all the love they brought. And you were approaching different parts of the body and thanking your mom for all the kindness and the words she speaks and the love she shared and the children she birthed. That's beautiful. But most people, when someone is dying, they're not prepared to do a ceremony right at the time of death. It takes preparation. So you need to think about it ahead of time. And most people don't realize that these rituals are available. They can create them themselves. What would be appropriate for your family? Maybe it's just holding hands with the family, holding hands around the body of the loved one and saying goodbye or singing a song and then letting go. So ceremonies can be very simple.
Yeah. And Kitty, I just wanted to say too, is that a lot of times, like, unless I actually went to this Afterlife conference, how would I have known that there are these different rituals that you could do? I mean, Terry, that was just beautiful. And, that just gave me another idea. Maybe I'll have the opportunity to do a blessing of the body. I think some of these things, and that's why this conference is so important, is that you don't even know exactly what to do, or maybe you haven't even been introduced to this concept of ritual. And, especially being in a hospital, the way that people grieve, it's very different for all, cultures and stuff like that. But I just think that this is a great conversation that we're having to give some ideas out there as well. Some things that maybe people have never thought of before.
Well, one of the nice things about inpatient hospices, and we don't have too many of those, especially in California anymore, they're usually small, maybe 10 beds, and the staff, it's very intimate setting. The ones I've worked in were like a big house, and they always did rituals. They did things like open the window after somebody dies so the soul can fly out. They had the little electric candles. They had volunteers whose job it was to do nothing but make quilts, like little old ladies who make quilts. And they had just cabinets full of these journey blankets. And so we would take the quilt. I mean, I learned a lot of it just by working in an inpatient hospice, which is a good segue to you, David.
All right. Well, that's really interesting, because one of the things that Kitty said was that one can't immediately enter into ceremony and be prepared for this sort of end-of-life care. And I think that the work that we've been doing in the acute care setting, meaning in the ICU setting, and while I'll say parenthetically that the majority of my work has been in the children's ICU, dealing with children all the way from prematurity up into young adult years. This really is, I think, fitting for all the patients that we take care of. And most patients who are in an intensive care unit receiving acute medical therapies have families who are sitting at the bedside, often in what I would call victim mode. The family is victimized by the patient's critical illness, by the life-threatening illness, by the unexpected trauma that occurred, by the unexpected drowning in a swimming pool, any number of things that may have occurred. And I think in the last year with the pandemic, there were probably countless families around the world who were experiencing the same sort of overwhelming impending loss, grief, and not having a good place to put their energies. Most families, I find, when they're in the acute stage, are desperately trying to achieve cure and restoration of full health and longevity for their loved one, whether it's an adult or a child. And that the important thing here is that when you're in your head full of fear and worry and anxiety, you're not necessarily connected with your heart. And when you're not connected with your heart, it's hard to be connected with the soul of the other individual. So that a lot of the work that I have done with my shamanic healing colleague from Sacramento, whose name is Jana Din, has been to come up with approaches, we can call them rituals, that lead into ceremony, that take people out of their heads, their worry and their fear, bring them down into a mindful, quiet place in their hearts where they can be open to the wisdom of the universe that may inform them as to what decisions need to be made for their loved ones. We often talk about connecting a parent, especially with children, connecting in particular a mother heart to heart with her child, which allows her to listen in a non-verbal, non-cognitive way to what the child's spirit is telling her. Because ultimately, all of life is a journey. Illness is simply one of the stops along the journey in life that has important lessons and information to offer the individual. Sometimes it's the child offering the parent lessons. Sometimes it's the parent offering comfort and teaching back to the child. So that what we're really dealing with is how to move people who are unprepared, people who have not done years of meditation training, months of mindfulness training, and are totally unprepared for the acute situation they've been thrust in, how to guide them to a mindful state, to a meditative state, so that they can access the transpersonal realms that exist surrounding all of us and the information that exists in those transpersonal realms. That is how we have striven over the last 6 or 7 years to create ritual, to lead to ceremony, to honor the soul contracts between parent and child. And often it's a soul contract between healthcare provider and patient. And these then lead to some of the questions of what rituals do healthcare providers have to deal with the death of patients. And we could talk about that later if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Terry, I know that you had some questions about that and the rituals in the clinical setting, so I wanted to give you that opportunity to ask.
Yeah, well, David just said a lot about, about being prepared and not being prepared. And of course, we all know that in this culture, we have such a lack of rituals. As you were saying, April, family basically has a funeral, then they go to someone's house and they eat. And then for a week or two, maybe a week, people bring food over to the bereaved person's house. Sorry. And that's the end of ritual. That's it. In some, like in the Jewish traditions, a year after the death, you have a revealing of the headstone. It takes a year, and they place the headstone. You have a ceremony for that. You light a candle every year, and it's very empty. There just isn't anything meaningful. So just a simple ritual, like another thing we did for my mom at her actual funeral, was I passed around a basket of rose petals to everybody, and everybody took 3 rose petals. I learned this from Austin Wells. She actually taught me this one. And you blow into each of the 3 rose petals. And the first one you blow, all your pain and sadness and how much you're going to miss the person. In the second one, you blow all the love and the fond memories and the connectiveness that you feel. And in the third one, you blow a message that you want to give to that person. And it was a coffin, open around the grave, and everybody got up around the grave and threw their rose petals into the grave on top of the coffin. So all that love and all those memories and all those messages go symbolically, of course, with the spirit. I mean, the spirit already knows all that stuff, right? But it's the making a symbolic representation of your feelings, of your experience, of your love, of your whatever, your trauma, whatever. And with a symbolic representation, you actually have a tangible object that you can hold in your hand, a rock or a rose petal. And you can work with that object, move it around in space, throw it in a river, put it on an altar, put it on top of your head, whatever. And that creates a physical form with which you can work with your grief versus just having your grief choked up inside of you as a very powerful emotion.
Great, thank you. And David, can you talk a little bit more about the rituals in the clinical setting?
Well, I think rituals in the clinical setting are extremely individual. And the first thing is that a ritual that comes simply from the head and is full of empty words maybe does not have the impact that we would hope that it would have. But I think the corollary of what I'm really saying is that one needs to be connected in one's heart, one's emotions, one's spirit with what one's intention is for the individual who is in the process of dying, about to die, or has just died, knowing that the spirit tends to hang around the body even after death for a variable period of time, depending on what its own agenda is. For example, I've told my family that I don't want to be cremated for at least 3 days after my body is dead, because I would like time for the soul to separate and go to wherever it's going to go to next and complete that part of its life's work. Why do I choose 3 days? Because I think that the great Rabbi Jesus rose on the 3rd day, and that's how I picked 3 as far as that goes, but 3 is also a mystical number. So to get to rituals, they're individual. They need to come from the heart. They need to include intention, because the shamanic teaching is that energy follows intention. And so we set our intention for the individual. And in so doing, we are able to channel the energy more effectively. I think that this is part of the reason that very conventional hospice chaplaincy has not been as impactful as it could be, because the typical chaplain may not be in that almost meditative, heart-centered place, may not have the same intention that I have, or perhaps Kitty has when attending to a dying individual. And so it tends to be a little bit more empty. And I'm going to give you an example of one of the rituals that I use. I have a practice that involves, after 35 years of being a children's intensive care unit physician and researcher, I have a ritual that I've developed over the last 15 or 20 years when I am discontinuing artificial life support in patients, where I do a couple of things. One is that I tend to hold the tops of the feet, the dorsum of the feet, with my hands, and I try to ground myself and then run energy for the person based upon energy training that I've had, so that I can energize or support the human spirit in that individual in the journey of disconnecting from the body and allowing it to go to wherever spirit and soul goes to next. So that's the one energetic ritual that I do, that I can do without any words, and that I can do with full intention to try and support that spirit on its final journey, at least final journey of this lifetime. And the other ritual that I've developed is that I say a prayer, sometimes out loud to those who are present, and otherwise always to myself. And the prayer has to do with asking that all of the pain and suffering of this lifetime remain and die with the body as the body dies, and not be carried forward with the spirit into the next lifetime, and that the spirit only carry with it those experiences, memories that are useful, constructive, and will be helpful for the spirit's future life. So what I'm trying to do with this intention is to have all the toxicity of this life experience, all of the negative experiences as possible, remain and disperse, die with the body, and to take forward only useful material learned in this lifetime that will serve the spirit in its future journeys. That is my personal routine and ritual.
That is fantastic. And this makes me want to go over to Kitty, because, and by the way, Ken Doka is also joining us, and we'll bring him in a minute. Hi, Ken. But Kitty, just quickly piggybacking off of what David just said, can you talk about the death spiral? Is that something you can, easily describe? Because that's kind of what David was talking about doing, holding the feet of the person who's died and kind of, aiding in the separation process. I know it's a long, complicated thing and not easy to describe quickly.
Well, the death spiral is a ceremony that you can perform. It is complicated and it does require practice. But I think this conversation is so rich. David, I appreciate what you said about bringing people into their heart. And I find that we work a lot with people and allow breath to bring them from their heads down to their heart and expand it. It's an energy practice, as you know. And that breath can be shared without any words. That heart-to-heart connection is so important. Plus, I agree with you that you need to set an intention with your rituals. What is you trying to do with your rituals? If you're making a heart-to-heart connection, that's your intention. And then you need to be really present for it. Your heart presence, not your brain presence, but your heart presence. Now, going back to what Terry was asking about, the Great Death Spiral is a blessing, really, and a releasing of the energetic field around a person after they've died, so that Terry was doing a part of it, blessing the different chakras, of the person, and then allowing them to be released, and you let go. A letting go practice is very important all through the caregiving sequence. The rituals we do with caregivers, David, you mentioned the staff. Oh, they are so in need of rituals to help them let go and know that they did the best work they could. So breath, attention, intention, being aware that rituals are available, and reading or attending conferences like this to find out more about what's going on and what's available.
Something I'd like to add about breath. If you ever have the opportunity to sit with a dying person, and this is possible, this is one of the most profound mystical things I've ever experienced, is as the person sitting with the dying, to synchronize your breathing with them. And I have often done this with patients. And of course, as you know, their breathing is very irregular and strange as they're dying, but not always. And so sometimes you can just watch them breathe and match your respirations with theirs, and it kind of syncs you up, and you can really kind of feel where they're going. And I've had many really profound mystical experiences by doing that. So the breath connection is extremely important, not always easy to do. Ken, welcome.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, Ken, I'm going to introduce you because we don't have a formal, but Ken is the senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America, teaches in the gerontology department, I believe.
Well, emeritus now.
Emeritus, yeah, at New Rochelle College. I'm remembering all this from your bio. And he's written like 30 books, and he's considered one of the top death and grief researchers working in the field right now. We're really honored to be in his presence. Thank you.
To be here.
Yeah, and this will be your second year at the Afterlife Conference, so really excited to have you. And we're talking about, death and grief rituals in a clinical setting, but not necessarily in a clinical setting. Would you like to say something about that?
Well, I mean, some of my work has been on what I've called therapeutic ritual. And what therapeutic ritual is actually using ritual as a strategy in grief counseling. So, for example, and most of us have these rituals that we use anyway. I talk about rituals of continuity, for example, where you would do something like, in our house, one of ours is that when we put up our Christmas tree, the first 3 ornaments we put on are ornaments, memorial ornaments to my parents and then to my godson's father. And there are a number of other types of rituals, marking transitions, allowing reconciliation, or simply allowing the affirmation of a relationship. So it's an area that I have a lot of interest in.
Yeah, I was just mentioning about the article on rituals that I just recently had published in Omega, and I talked about, I quoted you in here, I'm actually looking for it right now, where you talk about the different functions of ritual, which you just said, remind me what you just, I'm looking on the paper right now to find it. Honoring, hold on. Just a minute.
Well, while you're looking for that, Terry, I also just wanted to share because, Ken, you reminded me of just a situation with a client that I had this past Christmas. And one of my clients was getting all of her Christmas ornaments and stuff out to decorate. And she really wasn't sure if she wanted to decorate, for the holiday season because her mother had passed. And she took out all of the stockings. And she realized that like half of the people had died, and she was like really triggered by this and didn't know what she wanted to do with the stockings. So she ended up making an ancestor tree. So she kept the stockings, she put them up, and then created an ancestor tree alongside of the regular Christmas tree. So, just your suggestion about the ornaments just made me remember about that idea. And it was a really beautiful way for her to turn the way that she was looking at these stockings, because the stockings, it just felt so heavy for her. And then we were talking about, well, what's a way that you can honor the ancestors that have passed and still keep their spirit alive and in your living room for the holiday season? So I just wanted to share that quick little
That's
tip
great.
there.
That's a wonderful
Yeah,
message.
I found what I was looking for. So it's three in one research project. They interviewed 10 psychotherapists about grief rituals and came up with three specific functions of ritual: honoring, letting go, and self-transformation, which makes perfect sense. I mean, that just kind of sums it all up, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
You can't let go without honoring first, and you can't experience healing and transformation without letting go and honoring. And the thing about letting go is that's really language that we don't use anymore in the grief world, because it kind of harkens back, to the old Freudian model of you're supposed to disconnect from the object or the person that you're grieving. And to say letting go kind of says, like, you got to get over it. You got to let go. This is really an old model that is not helpful. So instead of letting go, what would we say instead? Transform, reframe.
It's so interesting that in the many, many families that I've dealt with, who have had children die of all ages, it's almost a universal reality that many of the mothers have said that even after the child's body has died, they still feel a strong connection to the child's spirit.
Sure.
And this kind of soul connection is something that we need to honor, figure out how to work with, incorporate in our rituals. Putting something on our altars or mesas to honor and focus our energy on. And even your idea, Terry, that you mentioned about blowing into the rose petals. This is a very standard shamanic technique where you blow the energy, and it's the ruach in Hebrew. You blow in your intention, your energy into this object, and it creates a different vibration in the object conceptually that then takes on the meaning of itself, but gives you something tangible. And I very routinely try to create some sort of memorial for these patients as well, so that there's a physical, tangible place to focus one's energy.
Beautiful. Thank you so
David,
much.
I think this is interesting that you mentioned that the mothers stay connected with the soul. And it's so important for families who have lost children in particular to tell stories and reframe the story. Many parents will go into some kind of work in relationship to the type of death, but it's also important to tell the story of why was my child here? What was the love that was shared? That the mythic preparations for death, the mythic rituals around death, storytelling, working with the ancestors, developing those connections so that our loss, we don't let go. We reform, we transform those connections so that we can live from our heart and live connected, which really helps us process our grief and stay connected on holidays with our ancestors and our loved ones.
And Ken, can you talk a little bit about continuing bonds, because that's definitely where we're going now.
Really is actually it's the culmination of a lot of people's work, but particularly the work of Dennis Klass, Nickman, and Phyllis Silverman, who wrote about that, and that was a real change in the paradigm. And a number of us were writing at the time about this old kind of notion of Freudian detachment. Freud saw the process of bereavement as a process to withdraw emotional energy from the deceased and reinvest it in others. And of course, Dennis Klass is an interesting guy. And one of the things that he taught, actually his specialty was in religious studies, was he taught Eastern religions. And he thought, well, if detachment is the goal, and the therapeutic goal of grief counseling, then half the world is doing it wrong, because in most Eastern religions, there are notions of honoring ancestors and and all these other kinds of related concepts. And so And then Dennis actually started working with Compassionate Friends as an advisor in the very beginning of that organization, and of course saw that parents didn't want to lose their connection to their child. And he wrote a little bit about what he called the inner representation, and what he meant by that was that parents of bereaved children carried with them an image of the child. So if your child died at 6 and is 10 years later, you kind of thought, well, what would my child look like at 16? Would he or she be driving? All these kinds of things. And so that led him to do some further work, and of course some other people were writing in this line too. But the notion of continuing bonds, now that we, as you said, we reformulate our connection with the child, is really current theory and well accepted in the field now.
Well, and I would say too, in talking about this continuation of these bonds is also the conversation about consciousness doesn't die, right? I mean, people are still able to feel that connection, that, consciousness and who we are is so much more than just the physical body.
Yeah, I mean, that consciousness is talking to us all the time. I just heard a podcast today with a guy, I will look up his name, who did his PhD dissertation on grief dreams. And this is something, I'll pass it along to everybody because it's really wonderful work. What are grief dreams? Are they fantasies? Are they the brain conjuring up some images? Are they communications, from other dimensions? All of the above. But yeah, the continuing bonds thing is so important because, as Ken was saying, that before Dennis Kloss and his work, everybody in therapy pretty much used the Freudian model, which is get over it, move on, recover, let go. And this really changed everything. And I think, this is my theory, is that continuing bonds became recognized by psychology because after China invaded Tibet in the 1950s, the teachings of the Tibetan monks came to the West, kind of trickled in very slowly into about the early 1960s, and people were starting to discover Buddhism and the concept of consciousness living outside of the body. And I really think that contributed to psychology picking up on it. And with that came rituals. Because if your intention is to just cut off the relationship, they're dead, I am no longer in relationship with this person, then what rituals can you do? You really can't. I mean, the rituals seem to be inextricably tied in to continuing the relationship in some form.
Well, I think that highlights part of what has been missing in Western Judeo-Christian kind of thought process as well. And we've hinted at that a little bit, even in this conversation, whether it's an Eastern Buddhist approach to things or the idea of spirit and dream journeying and things is actually part of everyday life for the Aboriginal shaman or the African shaman or the South American shaman or any other groups of people who work in what's known as the transpersonal realm. And Jung was clearly focusing on this as part of his work as well. Maybe Ken can speak to that more. But the real question is, how do I, as a Western clinician, impact my medical colleagues who have a very left brain approach to things? The majority have a very kind of monotheistic view of life. How do I impact them to understand that there is, as Hamlet said, far more things in heaven on earth than are described by our school teachings? That this has been the challenge for me to figure out, how do we help families to access that spiritual realm or domain so that they can stay in touch with the deceased loved one's spirit, so that they communicate and learn from it, etc. I think that there's a lot that we in the Western medical field and the hospice world in particular can do to incorporate many of these rituals and ceremonies that are used by so-called less well-developed societies that allow us to access these spiritual domains.
Well, another reason that we're able to learn these ceremonies is because we have the internet now, and we can easily see what these other cultures are doing. That's where we have to go. We have everything to learn from them. In fact, everything we're talking about here really is basically coming from outside the modern Western Judeo-Christian American culture. Thankfully. I mean, one of the things I loved best in seminary was the students from all over the world. And now I'm a teacher, and they're my students, and they're from Africa and the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And I just love what they come in and teach me. They are definitely the teacher most of the time.
Well, you know, Terry, in our workshops, we have a lot of medical folks, nurses and doctors that attend, and we try to expand it so that we are incorporating the Western culture. We start at the literal preparations for death, and this would be writing your documents. And then we step it up and we work on emotional rituals so that you can be in touch with your emotions. We do breath work so that you can calm and transform those emotions when you get fearful or anxious or sad. Then we step it up again to the mythical and the storytelling, as I mentioned before. And then we can easily slide into the energetic that David so wonderfully talked about, where you're sharing your energy. Simply, no words, no mind, just an exchange of energy. And energy, you know, according to physics, energy never goes away. So you can always connect energetically. So we need to take all cultures, and bring them together at the literal, the emotional, the mythical, and the energetic. It's really quite exciting. And then I watch the doctors, their eyes open a little wider, going like, that was sort of interesting when I experience it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting this in the hands of doctors. That's where we need to go. Getting this into medical school, you know, not even, you know, extremely into the woo-woo world. I mean, there's this new thing that came up. They call it the medical moment. Have you heard of this? Where it's something they're talking about in emergency rooms or in ICUs or places where people die, you know, in dramatically, I should say. And they encourage the staff who's present at that death to just stop and take a moment. That's all. That's all it is. It's not spiritual or religious or anything. It's just, don't run back to your desk. Don't go run to the next room or something you have to do on the floor. Just stop and stay with the body and have a moment of silence for 60 seconds before you go off to your next patient. I mean, generally in a busy hospital, they don't even have 60 seconds to do that. It's, you know, one trauma after the other, I come from a whole family of ER doctors, so I hear this stuff from them all the time. Family dinners in my family, with me being a hospice chaplain and them being in the ER, quite entertaining.
I bet. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming together today. And were there any last minute comments or questions that you wanted to throw out there before we wrap up? This has been a great conversation on death and rituals. I think you guys gave the audience so many different ideas and things to do, the importance of it, and definitely the takeaway of coming into the heart center, having that intention is really important. Terry, anything else that you'd like to add?
Just come to the Afterlife Conference, which I believe starts in about 2 weeks or 10 days or 12 days or something like that. We're all going to be there. This is what we're going to talk about. This is what we study and what we teach and what we share. And all of you guys, I'm so grateful to all of you for the beautiful work that you do and what you've been teaching. So I am very grateful to all our followers on Facebook and whoever's listening to this, and to you, April and Mike, for putting this together. Ken, David, and Kitty, thank you so much for being with us today. I love talking to you all.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And again, you can go to the website to purchase your ticket, afterlifeconference.com. That's where you can register. There is the general admission ticket, and then there are also pre and post workshops that you can also buy a ticket for as well. So we look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you all so much for joining us for Facebook Live this Friday. We will be back next Friday, and so tune in. Take care, everyone.